Welcome to the Capital and Country podcast. I'm your host, Harry Stewart. In this episode, we're going to look through a bit of a wish list for me on what I think Labor can tackle in terms of reforms. Some of the big items include a referendum on making Australia a republic, all the way to tackling gambling advertisement. First, let's look at the market vitals. The Australian share market reached a 3-month high, buoyed by strong economic indicators and positive global sentiment. The S&P ASX 200 index, representing the top 200 companies on the Australian Securities Exchange, rose from 8,360.9 to 8,407.6, marking a modest gain of approximately 0.56%. Consumer spending rose by 0.6% in April, and the unemployment rate held steady at 4.1%, signalling economic resilience. The materials sector saw 2.6% gain, driven by a 1.9% increase in iron ore prices. Notably, Life 360's shares surged by 27.6% following a robust quarterly earning. So why does it matter? Why do equities matter? So for investors, rising ASX 200 suggests that many companies are performing well, which can boost the value of superannuation funds and personal investments. For businesses, improved market confidence can lead to increased investment and expansion opportunities. Looking at the bond market, bond yields declined following the RBA's decision to cut the cash rate to 3.85%. The 3-year government bond yield dropped by 15 basis points to 3.5%, while the 10-year yield decreased by 5 basis points, 0.44%. This movement reflects a dovish tone from the RBA, and revised inflation projections suggested that headline inflation will likely remain near the midpoint of 2 to 3% target range. So why does this matter? So for borrowers, lower interest rates can reduce mortgages and loan repayments, easing household budgets. For savers, returns on savings accounts and term deposits may decrease, affecting income from interest. For the economy, lower rates aim to stimulate spending and investment, supporting economic growth. Currency. The Australian dollar experienced modest fluctuation influenced by global economic factors and domestic monetary policy adjustments, trading at around 0.64 cents to the US dollar. What does this mean? For travellers, a weaker AUD makes overseas travel more expensive. For importers, imported goods become costlier, potentially leading to higher retail prices. For exporters, Australia's products become more competitively priced overseas, benefiting exporters. And finally, commodities. Australia is facing a significant wheat surplus due to reduced Chinese imports and increased competition from Russian exports. Between October and March, wheat exports to China fell sharply, leading to an anticipated carryover of 5 to 6 million tonnes from the previous season's crop. This surplus may necessitate discounted sales to manage storage and upcoming harvests. Why does this matter? So for farmers, excess supply may lead to lower wheat prices, impacting farm incomes. For consumer, lower wheat prices could translate to cheaper bread and related products. For the economy, agriculture export revenue may decline, affecting rural economies. On to the headlines. The opposition coalition reunites, comprising the Liberal and National parties just a week after splitting due to policy disagreements, followed by a major defeat in May's federal election. The brief split was triggered by differences on policies concerning nuclear energy, market regulation, and regional issues. Defence readiness under scrutiny. A report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute warns that the Australian Defence Force risks becoming a paper ADF due to government's focus on long-term projects at the expense of immediate readiness. The report highlights shortages in critical capabilities and delays in key programs, raising concerns about national security amid regional tension. Controversial gas project extension approved. Environmental Minister Murray Watt approved the Woodside Energy's application to extend the North West Shelf gas processing plant's life until 2070. The decision has drawn criticism from environmental groups and Indigenous leaders due to potential threats to ancient Murunjunga rock art and significant greenhouse gas emissions. So just touching briefly on the headlines, look, I think with the opposition coalition reuniting, I think it was, David Littleproud's whole line of this is a principle stance and, we want an answer and we don't want to waver on these policies, to basically backflip and rejoin the coalition and basically say, okay, well, we'll just let you do your review. It's not guaranteed that the party room on the Liberal side will accept or adopt any of these policies moving forward. And my understanding is Susan Lee does want to do a full end-to-end review. And so it just I think the Nationals blinked a bit here. I think that, you know, his whole line of, well, we don't want to get 12 months down the track when the review's done and realize that we're, not on common ground here anymore and we decide to split in 12 months. I mean, it sounds like they may end up splitting in 12 months anyway. The Liberals could turn around and go, no, we're not going to do nuclear. We don't want Telstra coverage or phone coverage in regional areas. We're not going to advocate for that. Like they could literally come back and just say no to all four of the major policies. And then the Nationals have to backflip again and leave the coalition or look weak. And so, I think that the Sharks are circling a little bit for David Littleproud with this backflip back into the coalition. And I think what's interesting is some of the front bench or the shadow cabinet decisions. You can definitely see that there's some, factional lines being drawn and people are getting demoted and promoted, notably for the Nationals, two previous leaders, Barnaby Joyce being one of them, not finding a spot. And so, look, I think that's interesting. I think for the gas project, interestingly enough, this decision by Murray Watt is basically just to keep, my understanding of it is to keep the processing plant alive. It's not to expand it. And when making the administrative decision on extending it, he couldn't actually take into consideration some of the existential or external impacts like First Nations concerns around preserving rock art or the gas emissions. So I think that decision, it sounds not great, but I think it's probably a bit of I think it's one that's been a bit overblown. I think that it's just expanding the life, and he administratively didn't have the power to consider those, other areas when deciding whether to extend it or not. Looking to Indigenous affairs, Pat Dodson calls for action. Former Labor Senator and Yaruru and Yaruru. Former Labor Senator and Yarru elder Patrick Dodson has strongly condemned Australia's high rates of Aboriginal youth incarceration and child removals, labelling the situation as an ongoing genocide against First Nations people. He emphasised the need for progress on the Uluru Statement from the Heart's key goals: a voice to Parliament, national truth-telling, and a Makarrata Commission for treaty making. Tasmania's shift from treaty to truth-telling. The Tasmanian government has announced it will no longer pursue a treaty with Aboriginal people, but will instead focus on the comprehensive truth-telling and healing process. The 2025-26 budget will fund the appointment of 2 independent Aboriginal truth-telling commissioners, aiming to recognise historical injustices and promote healing. Death in custody investigation. On May 27, 2025, a 24-year-old Aboriginal man died in Alice Springs police custody after being restrained during an altercation at Coles supermarket. The Northern Territory Police have launched a major crime investigation into the death, classifying it as a death in custody. So, I think for me, I take a more pragmatic approach to the Uluru Statement of the Heart. I think, we had the referendum, we weren't successful with it. I'd love to see, and I toyed with having this in the reform wish list conversation later in this episode around, can we potentially legislate a voice to Parliament? Look, I think given that Labor has such a strong mandate for the next likely 6, if not 9 years, why don't we have a crack and legislate it and see what the benefits are of it and try to integrate it into, or make it somewhat of a convention, maybe not a constitutional convention. I don't think 9 years is probably long enough to make it a constitutional convention, but, how do we play around the edges where we're clearly not in a position where we want to tackle some of these things, but how do we just keep moving forward? And I agree. I think that Aboriginal youth incarceration and child removal is awful. And one of the reform wish lists I've got is a review and a look and an increase in the age of criminal responsibility, the age of criminal responsibility for young people. I think that, locking kids up is not the answer to revitalizing their lives and bringing them back into a community to be thriving, prosperous people in a community. I just don't think that that's the answer. On the death in custody, again, I think looking at some of the theories that I have learnt in my current JD is that we've got this penal populism, this kind of over-criminalization of everything, and the process ends up becoming the punishment. So this Aboriginal man that's died in custody, he's had an altercation at Coles supermarket. I don't know whether it's alleged that there was an assault, which is essentially sort of threatening or the fear of violence, battery, which is actual physical contact, or if it's just public nuisance. So it'd be good to look into what it actually was that he was restrained for. But I think at the end of the day, if this man is known, if he identifies himself, you can provide a court summons for the summary offence that he's potentially committed. I don't even know if he's committed an offence. But at the end of the day, they've decided to restrain him. They've taken him back. I don't know if they've taken him back to the jailhouse or whether they've just restrained him and he's passed away. But I think that, it's and I, again, don't know the NT legislation as well as the New South Wales, but arrests are meant to be the last resort. And so it's a shame that something like this has happened over probably something so insignificant as an altercation at Coles. But yeah, look, I think that, again, if I had time, and podcast is probably going to be a long one, I might, I might do a second podcast around criminal reforms that I think that we could look at, because I think it does warrant a whole nother conversation. And so, yeah, I'll take a note. Let's do that, because I think that, clearly we're still getting bad outcomes, youth incarceration rate, child removals, death in custody. And these are the types of things that are voiced to Parliament and, treaties and national truth telling are meant to really stare into and come up with some solutions for. And so it's almost as if we're not even willing to do the hard work to look at some of these stuff. But I think it's so important. It's heartbreaking. It just feels like justice it's not even at the party. It's just not there. All right. Well, we're going to pivot to today's larger conversation and the topic of my LinkedIn newsletter, Capital and Country. I think getting more involved, and I think, full disclosure, I am a part of the Labor Party, recently joined a couple of weeks before the election. And so I, potentially hold some bias here, but I think my whole philosophy of politics is that I don't want to get into this ideological state of I believe what I believe and that is it and it's the truth and it's gospel. I want to understand things from any side of the aisle, and I want to also challenge, Labor smashed the election. Like, they won decisively. And I think when you garner so much political capital where it's so rare that an incumbent in their second election increases their margin and increases their seats as decisively as Labor did, I just think that why waste that on, and don't get me wrong, we talked about what Labor intends to do over the next 3 years, what they took to the election, and I still think that that is quite big and bold. But I also think that why stop there when there are so many different areas and different demographics, different cultures, different, issues out there crying for a bit of attention at the national level? Why not see if we could tackle some of these big, bold, ambitious reforms? So for me, I'm going to go through line by line of some of my ideas that I'd love to see implemented. Some I might skim past because I've got 18 pages here printed out of things that I want to talk about, and we're currently on page 3. So yeah, let's kick off. So first for me, and these are not in priority order, these are just in order of how I research them. But first for me is disinformation and misinformation reform. Before the 2025 election, the Albanese government promised to take action on the corrosive spread of misinformation and disinformation online. And they tried. It was drafted. It was a heavily consulted bill. Then nothing. it feels like it's just disappeared. The combating misinformation and disinformation bill has gone quiet. I think we need to ask why. And the proposed reform, the option 3 in the government's own impact and analysis, would give Australian Communications and Media Authority the power to enforce codes of practice. So it would require transparency reports from digital platforms, empower users with tools to spot misinformation, and create rules to handle public complaints. I think as someone who's worked in financial services, studied law, watched the erosion of public trust in real time, I can't help but see the failure to legislate here as both a policy risk and a walk away from sort of the moral implications of that. So for me, I see firsthand, whether it be friends or family members that, will send me something and go, oh, did you see this? Did you see that? And you just peel the information back a few layers and you realize that it's, not true. It's fantasized, it's embellished, it's over the top and not quite accurate. But I think that it's really dangerous. I think that, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think that our political discourse is becoming too coarse. And I'd like to try and be a voice in Australia that brings us back to the center and sort of tempers our conversations. But I think it's so easy when there's all this mis and disinformation out there to just start being so angry at each other. I think, you know, when you look at marketing philosophies from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, those marketing executives that are going out there and pitching to the likes of VB and Holden, it's all about sex sells, right? So you've got beautiful women, beautiful men, let's be honest, mainly beautiful women, on the hood of a car or drinking a beer, or the man drinks the beer and a beautiful woman appears, right? So the idea was around how sex sells. The pendulum has swung, and marketing agencies, which have now kind of folded into social media companies, they've realized that, sex sells, it does, but hate sells more. Hate sells way more. And so when we get into these vicious cycles, and I think AI is a massive accelerator to this, when we get in the cycle of people spreading things that aren't true about different types of people, whether it be trans people, gay people, black people, Asian people, Jewish people, Muslim people, it's just so easy to go, I don't like that about that person or that group of people. So let's just start dunking on them. Let's just go hard in the paint at them and just dunk on them. And so I think it's we need to start tackling some of this thing. I think that it's just such a threat to our society. And I think, this whistle that we have of, it's eroding democracy and et cetera, et cetera. It is, but fundamentally, it's just eroding the trust we have of our neighbors, of who we live next to, of who we go to work with. We really should be looking at this and tackling it. And I think that the government tried, and I think that they should get the balls to try this again and get it across the line. Just looking at my notes, I think I've talked a lot about it, but I think that, again, I think the biggest thing here, and we'll again talk about it from a political advertisement reform, is, the voice referendum was just it was just allowed to spread unchecked some of the information that just was blatantly not true. Bots flooding comment sections, posts blaming Aboriginal people for crimes, alleging that Aboriginal people, and creating conspiracy theories that they'd start taking over your land. And I think that the platforms let it happen. We're allowing the foxes to guard the henhouse. I think that, we expect our Lord and Saviors, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, to take a stance, but it's in their financial interest to not. So why do we expect that they're going to? And so I think that, they're And again, I think my philosophy is they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're there to make as much money for the company in order to add value, to bring the share price up, to stimulate and help the share owners, win. Ultimately, that's what they're there to do as the director, as the CEO of a company. And so they're doing what they're supposed to do. This is where we need our elected officials to stand up, grow a bit of a backbone, and say that we're not going to accept this in this country and legislate and regulate a framework where they can no longer do that. And I guarantee you, these people are smart. They will figure out how to make just as much money and not be so insidious about it. So, reform number one, mis and disinformation. Reform number two, housing, negative gearing, capital gains tax. So I think we can all agree that Australia's housing market is broken. I think negative gearing, capital gains tax discount have turned property into tax shelters rather than a home. And I've talked about this a lot on my newsletter, that we are currently trying to save to buy a house. A house is a stretch, an apartment in Sydney, in the inner west, where we live, where we love living. We have great friends. We have a great community. We would love to live there. But just, I think under the current environment, it's just so hard. Brief story, we went to a development of a new set of flats close by to where we're currently living. And partner went in, had a good chat, came out, said, one of the selling points that the realtor tried to sort of sell to my partner was that we've had a foreign investor buy 5 already, they're going like hotcakes. And I get it, create a sense of urgency, supply demand, or, your first principles of economics and sales tactics. That's fine. It just so grotesque. It shouldn't be a prideful thing for a realtor to say, we've had one foreign investor buy 5 of the apartments. I just think that, when you've got a environment, negative gearing, capital gains tax, where, you can discount your capital gains tax and you can negatively gear your properties, it creates an environment where they can start accumulating and snowballing. And all of a sudden, all that equity that they've built up, they can continue to deploy that over and over again. And for people, that then drives house prices up. And it leads to an environment where young people like myself, who, again, admittedly earns quite a lot of money, who has a partner that also earns a really good living, we're a 2-person household income, and we struggle to save enough, buy a property or have a 20% deposit, or even a 10% or a 5% deposit that some of these schemes are, saying, oh, well, this is how you're going to get it. And what is crazy is we might see the goalposts and all of a sudden we kick the ball, we get that 5, 10, 20%, and all of a sudden house prices have gone up 10% in the last year, and all of a sudden the goalposts shift from under us and we miss left, and we have to save more money. And so I think for us, looking at it, Labor once had a plan to fix this. And I think it's time that they pick it back up. So under 2019 policy, Labor promised to limit negative gearing so it only applies to newly built properties instead of investment properties. Halve the capital gains tax discount for individuals from 50% to 25%. Notably, the changes would only appear to future investments. Current property owners would be grandfathered in. So it isn't a retroactive punishment. It's a line in the sand. And I think, I'm not advocating for everyone to start sort of feeling the pain and, having a commercially unviable property portfolio. I just think that we need to move on from this archaic housing system where we set these policies up that are so preferential and positive for older generations that all of a sudden younger generations struggle to enter the market. And so the Parliamentary Budget Office estimated the policy would boost the budget by 32.5 billion over a decade. That's money that could go into social housing, rental subsidies, or state planning reform. More importantly, the policy would tilt investors' interest towards new builds, which would help with some of the supply constraints that we've got. The modelling assumed a rise in investment in new dwellings from 22 to 30% by 2030. That means more homes, not just higher prices for the same old stock. As someone who's rented and saved and seen friends locked out of the market for years, I think Labor should pick this back up. Just someone pick it back up. Labor, and I am a party man, but if this is ground that no one wants to touch, I think that this could be a lightning rod for, a Liberal Party that decides to get some common sense about it, move back towards the centre, and try to tackle, a big demographic, a growing demographic in Australia, getting younger. We are now the biggest voting cohort in the country. I think if we want to appease and make sure that we're continuing to build political capital in now the largest cohort of voters, whoever looks to tackle this, I think could gain a lot of political goodwill. So yeah, look, I think we just need more affordable housing. We need people who want to stand up and actually say, let's give younger people a fair crack. Second, reform housing, negative gearing and capital gains tax. Third on the list is gambling advertisement. You win some, you lose more. That's the government's own message on gambling harm, and it's more true than they care to admit. Australians lose more to gambling per person than any country in the world. In 2022 alone, online gambling losses topped 25 billion. We're not just losing money, we're losing sleep, health, relationships, and in the worst case, lives. In 2023, the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs, Chair Peter Murray, released a landmark report. You win some, you lose more. It didn't mince words. The advertising of online gambling has normalised gambling as a part of sport and groomed children and young people to gamble. The report laid out a clear phased plan. Phase 1, ban ads during and an hour before and after live sports, including stadium signage. Phase 2, extend the ban to online and radio. Phase 3, ban all broadcast gambling ads between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Phase 4, implement a total ban across all media, including social media and sponsorship. But since the election, it's been, again, quite quiet, similar to disinformation, misinformation. I remember listening to an ABC podcast, Patricia Carvelis, Politics Now, and talking about why this was so difficult. And essentially, we'd be gutting the commercial viability of free-to-air TV. Free-to-air TV is basically living off the money from gambling advertisement. And again, we want to save free-to-air TV, which arguably no one watches, or if they do, it's an older demographic, for the sake of destroying and dismantling lives of younger people who are now trapped in this gambling cycle. And I think, anecdotal stories. I've played footy for over a decade. I've played in urban Australia, regional Australia. I've played overseas, and I spend a lot of time with young men and just grown men, and basically everyone gambles. You'll be at the pub after a game, or you'll be at a pub after training, and people will be putting on, multis, and they'll be looking at odds. And I just think I'm so grateful that I've not found the allure of that. But I also think that it's just so, if you can afford it, great. That's fine. I think gambling is totally fine. It's a bit of fun. People argue, which I disagree with, by the way, but people argue, the stock exchange is just as much gambling. It is, but you can tether that to something tangible and have qualitative and quantitative research, and people will start arguing. The Melbourne Storm are on the trot and West Tigers are struggling. People will go, oh, well, you can put some qualitative and quantitative data towards that. Look, don't get me wrong. I don't think we should be banning gambling. I just think that the romanticizing of it through gambling advertisement is inappropriate. And I think if it comes at the costs of losing free-to-air TV, either find the money to fund free-to-air TV publicly or figure out privately, sell assets to streaming services, start a conglomerate of all the channels so that they can become more commercially viable. Or, unfortunately, if they can't commercially make it in this new technological age, I'd rather someone have their life saved by not going into crippling gambling debt than watch another episode of Neighbours. So look, I think, and I had a acquaintance, I wouldn't say a friend, but an acquaintance when I was younger who I played football with, who ended up taking his life down in a regional town close to where I grew up. And you just don't understand how crushing that is for, the club, the family, the friends, this young bloke's future, all because, and it's silent. I think you'd have a better chance than not finding out that someone has a drug problem or an alcohol problem because you can't physically mask that. But gambling, you can. It's a quiet killer and anyone can do it. I could pick the phone up, grandma could pick the phone up and do it. So we need to start looking at tackling gambling advertisement again. I think that, again, we should be returning to looking at this. So that was number 3. Number 4, natural resource royalties. So Australia doesn't have a mining problem. It has a rent problem. We're the landlords of this country's natural wealth, but we've been undercharging our tenants for decades. Mineral rights belong to the Crown, that is, to all Australians. But our government, especially the states, are leasing out these public resources for far below market value. According to a 2024 report by Prosper Australia, we could be raising an additional 66 billion, yes, billion with a B, every year if we priced our resources like Norway does. Let that sink in. 66 billion. That's enough to abolish payroll tax and stamp duty, or fund the stage 3 tax cuts 3 times over without raising a cent of income tax. And yet, successive governments have failed to act. Queensland showed what's possible. When coal prices surged, they implemented a tiered royalty system. The result? 9.4 billion in extra revenue, 4,300 per household without deterring a single major project. Now imagine applying a similar variable royalty model across the country. The numbers from Prosper's modelling are staggering. 14.5 billion more per year just from smart tweaks to existing royalties. 38 billion more from coal over a decade. 33 billion more from iron ore. And 74 billion more from gas, 182% above current returns. This isn't a radical overhaul. It's a small policy pivot with massive returns. The idea is simple. When prices are high, we collect more. When prices drop, we ease off. Just like progressive income tax or holiday rental pricing. We're allowing mining companies, including foreign-owned ones, to treat this country like a discount mine shop. Chinese government-owned Yancoal and Japanese-owned Impex are raking it in while Australia picks up at crumbs. And let's be real. While resource lobbyists love to cry poor, the mining sector posted $242 billion in profits in 2022-23 alone. Meanwhile, we debate whether the government can afford another bulk build GP clinic. Norway captures 51% of their resource value. We capture just 16%. We don't need a revolution, we need royalty reform. If Labor wants to get serious about fairness and raise real money without hitting households, this is the policy. So natural resource royalty, to me, seems like a no-brainer. You've got channels like Friendly Geordie that talk about why we can't do it. And it's essentially because the mining industry is so big and powerful that they, at a snap of a finger, can change a policy in this space. Again, I would love it if politicians, and here's another thing. Politicians are fundamentally, they might do it because they care, but I think that there is also this sort of innate, you have to kind of be born with self-serving morals and values deep down, whether it be legacy, whether it be power, whatever it may be. But one thing I would say is they don't necessarily do it for the money. Like, some of these people are the brightest minds in the country and they could go off into the private sector and earn 10 times more than what they're currently earning. And I think that a big part of it is, donations and making sure that they get re-elected. And so I think, as the pinnacle of public service in this country, they probably should get paid more, but it should come at the expense of political donations and influence from lobby groups. And so I think, again, like these things sound so logical when you put them out there. They sound so logical and you go, why in the hell haven't we done this? And you realize that politics is a game and they play it, companies play it, and we sit here going, what the fuck is going on? With this, raising an additional $66 billion every single year could do so much good, and we've decided to kowtow to mining companies. Like, just get a backbone and implement some of these things. Like, just go, you know what? Fuck it. If I lose the next election because of this, it'll be well worth it. So just, yeah, look, those figures speak for themselves. I think, like, again, it just makes sense. It seems like common sense, and you go, why is this not happening? You know what? I thought that this was going to be way more of an optimistic podcast, but, you know, going through these again after writing about them just reminds me that sometimes we lack common sense. And I'm not talking about any party in particular. I'm talking about both parties or all politicians. You know, like, just let's get out of our own way. Like, at the end of the day, these resources belong to us. We should be charging more for them. This is fiscally and commercially a bad business. I love what I wrote around we're turning into the resource dollar store. Anyway, before I want to blow my brains out, let's move on from that to something way more cheery. Murdoch Media Empire Royal Commission. So we have one of the most concentrated media markets in the democratic world, News Corp, controlled by the Murdoch family, owns over 2/3 of the nation's print media, and its influence extends across radio, television, and digital platforms. In most capital cities, there's no contest. Murdoch owns the agenda. The Murdoch Media Bill 2023, introduced by Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, sought to establish a parliamentary commission of inquiry with the full powers of a royal commission to examine the influence of News Corp on Australian democracy. It had clear, urgent terms of reference. Is media regulation fit for purpose? Has media concentration stifled competition, distorted democracy, or eroded ethics? How has the media press shaped politics, public opinion, and polarisation? Yet, in October 2024, the Labor Majority Committee recommended against the bill, despite over 500,000 Australians previously signing a petition for a royal commission and multiple inquiries showing overwhelming public support. The government stepped back. I think we've all watched firsthand how Murdoch's reach distorts our democracy. Again, not to beat a dead horse, but the Voice referendum was a case study in this. Misinformation was platformed, dissenting voices were drowned, and coded racism was laundered through mainstream debate. This is not about silencing voices, it's about exposing the machinery. No media organisation should be above scrutiny, especially one that boasts editorial control across so many platforms, influences elections, and shapes national debate on war, race, and climate. Why would we have one family own 2/3 of all media in this country? It makes little sense. So the Murdoch Commission wouldn't just examine editorial bias, it would expose how headlines are coordinated between outlets, the lack of diversity in ownership and perspective, the revolving door between News Corp and politics, and the treatment of marginalised communities, particularly the LGBTQ plus community, First Nations Australians, and people on income support. Even former Murdoch insiders, including James Murdoch, have condemned the network's climate denial and polarisation. If the UK can hold inquiries into press ethics, the US can investigate misinformation spread by Fox News. Why can't Australia? Well, I mean, the Fox News one, it's not really happening at the moment, is it? So, what should Labor do? Labor should recommit to a royal commission into media concentration with a specific mandate to investigate News Corp's conduct, consider a media ownership cap or de-investment mechanisms to promote more competition, strengthen and consolidate media ethics and complaints mechanisms under a single independent body, implement public interest obligations for major platforms, including algorithmic transparency and access to diverse viewpoints. We talk about democracy, but we rarely protect its foundations. An unaccountable media monopoly isn't freedom, it's quiet coercion. Let's not wait for the next referendum, crisis, or war to ask how we let one family dictate the national conversation. The next reform, universal childcare, and I'm predicting that this will actually be a reform that is tackled by the current Labor government, and I have a sense that Albanese wants universal childcare to be his legacy, is my prediction. In its 2024 report, A Path to Universal Early Childhood Education and Care, the Productivity Commission has charted an ambitious yet achievable course to make early childhood education and care universally accessible, equitable, and high quality. The report outlines reforms like lifting the childcare subsidy to 100% for low-income families under 80,000, abolishing the activity test, expanding supply in thin markets, improving regulatory quality, and setting a goal of 30 hours a week of ECEC for all children aged 0 to 5 by 2036. These reforms are projected to boost participation, particularly among disadvantaged children, and deliver long-term social and economic benefits. What the numbers say. 1.4 million children attend approved ECEC services in Australia. 90% of 4-year-olds are enrolled, but children from low-income, remote, or vulnerable backgrounds are disproportionately missing out. A 100% subsidy for lower income households could increase participation by 10%, reduce costs for families, and raise long-term outcomes like school readiness and parental workforce participation. The CCS outlay would rise by 37% to 17.4 billion annually. 80% of families would receive a CCS rate of 75% or more. This is the Medicare movement for children. The economic case has been made. Investing in early learning lifts workforce participation, educational outcomes, and GDP. The moral case is even stronger. We're currently leaving behind the kids who would benefit the most. The Productivity Commission reports offers Labor a blueprint to finally give universal childcare the same public guarantee as schools and hospitals. But ambition would mean nothing without courage. The activity test, Labor's own relic from the Rudd years, still links a child's right to education to their parents' job status. Let that be the first policy to go. Then let's put our money where our values are and fully fund inclusion for children with disabilities and from First Nations backgrounds. Overall, I'm super supportive of universal childcare. I think to the point of it helping with school readiness and with parental workforce, particularly in regional and remote areas of Australia. I think that education is so important, and I think that it starts at a very young age. And I wish that I had more opportunities when I was growing up, because the person that I am today, if you wound the clock back 10 years, 15 years, I'm a very different person to what I was. Low literacy rate, numeracy rate. I was constantly getting in trouble. I saw no point in education. And now going through, I have a master's, I'm doing a second one, I've got a career. It actually matters. Like, it genuinely matters so much to be able to go and critically think about something for an extended period of time and think about the implications of art or science or law, politics. It's just so important. It also makes you more interested in the world around you. And so I'm so supportive of that. If that is Albo's one lasting legacy, I would be really happy. The next two I'm going to spend less time on, but I think they're both important. Sugar tax. Our obesity rate has tripled since 1980. Type 2 diabetes has nearly tripled since 2000. These diseases now contribute to 1 in 10 deaths. They cost the healthcare system billions of dollars annually. The Grattan Institute estimates that if left unchecked, obesity and diabetes could cost us up to $87.7 billion over the next decade. And yet the biggest driver of sugar consumption, sugary drinks, remains untaxed. That's not the case overseas. 117 countries now have some form of sugar-sweetened beverage tax. In the UK, the introduction of tiered tax cut sugar consumption from soft drinks by 46% in just 5 years. South Africa, similar numbers. Mexico, Portugal, and even Philadelphia have seen declines in childhood obesity, hospital admissions for dental surgery, and gestural diabetes. Grattan's proposed model is simple, fair, and targeted. No tax for drinks with less than 5 grams of sugar per 100 mils, 40% per litre for drinks with 5 to 8 grams of sugar per 100 mils, and 60% per litre for drinks with 8 grams or more. This would nudge manufacturers to reduce sugar, giving Australians healthier options, and it's working everywhere else. In the UK, the share of high sugar drinks dropped from 38% to just 7%. The Grattan model would cut sugary drinks consumption by 275 million litres a year, reduce average sugar intake by 700 grams per person annually, and raise 498 million in year one, funds that could go straight back into preventative health, dental care, or First Nations health programs. We tax cigarettes, we tax alcohol, but somehow liquid sugar that's sold to kids by the litre still get a free pass. Opponents say this hits poor people the hardest, but the truth is low-income Australians are hit hardest by diabetes, obesity, and tooth decay, and stand to gain the most from this reform. The average household would pay just 73 cents a week, and they'd get back many times over in health, quality of life, and avoided medical costs. If you're worried about the sugar industry, the tax would reduce consumption by just 0.5% of total production. Most of our sugar is exported. Manufacturers can reformulate. Grattan's model gives them time and incentives to do it. A sugar tax is the classic policy no-brainer. It's targeted, it's fair, it works. So just quickly on that, a big advocate. I think that why would we not look at this? I think it's, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, it's all interrelated. We're seeing more of it from an increase in sugar intake and other bad, substances that we take. So yeah, big advocate. Next one, alcohol tax. Kills more Australians than all illicit drugs combined. It fuels violence, drains the health system, and costs our economy 67 billion a year in social harms. But our tax system treats a 13 cask of wine and a 6-pack of full-strength beer like they're equal threats. They're not, and the tax says otherwise. Australia has 2 main alcohol taxes. The alcohol excise, which scales with the alcohol content and it's adjusted for inflation. And the wine equalisation tax, a relic of the GST era that taxes wine based on wholesale price, not alcohol volume. The result? Cheap wine is cheaper to tax, despite often having more alcohol. This warped structure encourages the production and consumption of low-cost, high-alcohol cask wine, the beverage of choice for the heaviest 10% of drinkers. More than a dozen government inquiries, from the Henry Tax Review to the National Alcohol Strategy, have called for volumetric taxation across all alcohol products, and the modelling is conclusive. Replacing the wine equalisation tax with excise could reduce overall alcohol consumption by up to 10.6%. It would save the health system nearly $2 billion a year, and it could deliver up to $2.8 billion in additional annual revenue, much of which could be put towards preventative and treatment programs. It's hard to overstate how broken this system is. 2 people could each consume 10 standard drinks, one through cask wine and the other through spirits, and the tax burden would be wildly different. Same hard, different tax. And guess who drinks the most cask wine? The poorest and sickest among us. People experiencing homelessness, chronic addiction, and intergenerational trauma. They're the ones paying, not in tax, but in health, housing, and dignity. Fixing the wine equalisation tax isn't just about punishing wine drinkers. It's about fairness. It's about removing perverse incentives that reward cheap harm and replace them with a consistent, evidence-based framework that prices alcohol according to its risk. Labor should abolish the wine equalisation tax and move all products to a volumetric excise based on alcohol content, adjust excise rates progressively with CPI linkage, earmark a portion of alcohol tax revenue for treatment, harm reduction, and health promotion, especially in Indigenous communities, close tax loopholes exploited by manufacturers reclassifying products like alcohol seltzers to dodge higher excise rates. This isn't new, it's overdue. Every year we wait, more people die, more hospitals overflow, and more families break under the weight of avoidable harm. It's time for alcohol tax reform. Again, same as the sugar tax, I think. It's a no-brainer. We can raise more money if we just tweak the policy slightly here and there, particularly around the wine equalisation tax. If we just tweaked it to be the same as the alcohol content for the rest of the alcohol categories, we would end up raising more money and we would save the health system just as much. And net, it's doubling. We're taking in more revenue and we're spending less on health systems. So, one close to my heart, next reform is the Australian Republic referendum. We are a sovereign nation, but our head of state is not. I think that contradiction sits at the heart of our democracy, and it's time that we fix it. Symbolically, we don't need a queen or now King Charles III to bless our decisions, appoint our Governor General, or symbolise our unity. We haven't had that for quite a long time. We have the institutions, we have the maturity, but what we lack is the political will to finish the job. I think for me, reading Malcolm Turnbull's book, A Bigger Picture, and talk about the Republic referendum he helped run in 1998, gave me the insight and the idea around being a republic. And I personally love the idea of unshackling ourselves from our colonial history. I think we should have our own head of state. I think that there should be safeguards involved, so we don't end up where we have this quasi king in the form of a president like the United States currently does. I think that they should largely just take the role of what the Governor General currently does, which is quite apolitical. It's not particularly present within the political spectrum. But yeah, I think it's more symbolic than anything. I think that, public support remains strong. A 2024 poll showed 64% of Australians prefer an Australian head of state over the British monarch. Indigenous leaders have long argued that a republic would allow us to redefine our national identity and acknowledge First Nations sovereignty. I completely agree. I think that if we take this to a referendum, it would allow us the space to acknowledge First Nations people as the original custodians of this land, but also build in some constitutional safeguards and support around, a voice, for example. Even former High Court Chief Justice Sir Gerard Brennan warned that any change to the UK monarch could leave Australia with no way of appointing a head of state. That's not sovereignty, that's constitutional dependency. The monarch is not just outdated, it's unrepresentative. Our head of state must be a Protestant, preferably male, descend from a single British family in a modern multicultural democracy. That is absurd. To me, this is not just a constitutional issue, it's a cultural one. We say we want recognition, equality, and independence, but we keep one foot in Buckingham Palace. We honour a crown whose sovereignty was imposed on Aboriginal people without consent or treaty. Becoming a republic won't undo the past, but it will break the chain of symbolism that still links our future to our colonisers. And let's be clear, this is a unifying issue. It's not about left versus right. Malcolm Turnbull led the Australian Republic movement, Peter Fitzsimmons picked up the mantle, and many young Australians have never sworn allegiance to the Queen, yet are expected to inherit her heirs. Lydia Thorpe, I see you there. Labor should commit to a republic by 2030 with a clear multi-stage process, plebiscite to ask Australians whether they support becoming a republic, public consultation on the model, e.g. parliamentary appointment versus direct election versus a hybrid, third, referendum with a strong civic education campaign, establish a Republic Transition Committee to consult widely, including with First Nations Australians, on a new Australian head of state model. Include republicanism in school civics curriculum to build public understanding and long-term consensus. Becoming a republic doesn't mean rejecting our history. It means writing the next chapter in our own name. Okay, next reform. 4-year terms referendum. So it would require another referendum on top of the Republic referendum. But Australia has a trust problem and a timing problem. Every 3 years, Australians are dragged back to the polls to elect a new federal government. It's one of the shortest electoral cycles in the democratic world. That means more time spent campaigning, less time governing, and it's no surprise that long-term issues, housing, climate, tax reform, a bunch of the things that we've already mentioned in this episode keep getting punted down the road. It's time we gave Canberra a full 4-year term, just like the states. Every state and territory has now moved to fixed 4-year terms for their lower houses. The benefits are obvious. Better policy continuity and planning, less pork barreling and short-term thinking, fewer snap elections triggered by political expediency. Back in 1988, Australians were asked to approve 4-year terms, but they rejected it. Why? Because the proposal didn't include term limits for the Senate, nor did it guarantee fixed dates. We had almost 4 decades to learn from that mistake. The 2021 House inquiry into constitutional reform considered the issue again, reviving a roundtable of experts who unanimously supported the move to 4-year terms. The committee was clear. Short terms undermine good government and erode voter confidence. 3-year terms are a joke. They're a relic of a bygone era when communication moved by mail coach and governments fell weakly. Today, they incentivize spin over substance. We end up with 12-month honeymoon periods, 12-month productivity windows, and 12-month re-election campaigns. More than anything, they stifle vision. No Prime Minister can genuinely tackle reform if they're constantly watching the electoral clock. How can we trust governments to lead when we don't even trust them to finish a full-term agenda? And let's be honest, voters are tired of constant elections, tired of the revolving door, tired of hearing the same promises recycled every 1,000 days. Labor should commit to a referendum on 4-year fixed terms by 2030, propose a model that includes fixed election dates to eliminate opportunistic timing, consistent Senate terms to align with House terms and simplify the ballot, stronger parliamentary oversight to prevent extended lame duck periods, fund a national education campaign to explain the benefits and contrast our system with those in place across the states and democracies like Germany, Canada, and New Zealand. Good government takes time. Let's give it the space to work and hold it accountable when it doesn't. Okay, the next reform is AI generally, and this is a big one, and I'm going to take quite a while to talk through this one, so I need a bit of runway. But I must say, it is the seminal piece of technology for my time. I think that it's got some immense upside to it. I think there's also some downside, whether it be, workplace, people's job security, dis and misinformation. And so I think that now is the time. And again, I think I subscribe that you're either a policy maker or a policy taker. And I think when it's come to the internet, social media, Australia's been a policy taker from the US, and we've basically let these companies do whatever they want. And to be honest, most of the time they don't even pay their fair share in taxes. And so we get these products, that's fine. They don't pay much taxes, whatever, that's fine. And then we get all of the downside that we get. So I think with AI, we really need to put our foot forward and be leaders in regulating this space, but doing it in a way where we don't constrain some of the growth potential that AI can bring to the economy in Australia, but also make sure that we're putting proper safeguards up so that we don't have the same outcome that we've had with, say, social media. So artificial intelligence, from medicine and education to warfare and workplace surveillance, AI is reshaping society at an unprecedented pace. And right now, Australia is underprepared. In its 2024 report, the Senate Select Committee on Adopting Artificial Intelligence called for a complete rethink on how we regulate, invest in, and govern AI. The message, act fast or get left behind. The committee found our current regulatory setting are not fit for purpose. Ethical principles and voluntary codes lack legal teeth. New legislation is needed urgently. High-risk AI applications include recruitment and hiring tools with embedded racial/gender bias, policing and sentencing algorithms that operate without oversight, generative models like ChatGPT or image generators that can spread disinformation, infringe copyright, or hallucinate facts, workplace surveillance tools that monitor employee keystrokes, mood, or bathroom breaks. Public trust is already low, and AI harms disproportionately affect vulnerable communities. The committee warns against letting AI development race ahead of governance, particularly when First Nations data, cultural content, and sovereignty are concerned. Handled correctly, AI could add $600 billion to GDP by 2030, CSIRO, Australia's economic strengths in health, mining, environment, and financial services makes us a perfect test bed for applied AI. There are already 544 AI-focused companies here. AI-related job listings have increased sevenfold since 2014, but we're losing ground to global competitors because of weak sovereign capabilities, we depend on US models, lack of coordinated public investment, and a fragmented, unclear regulatory environment. AI is once in a generation policy change, like climate change or the NBN. It's about shaping the future, not catching up to it. If Labor wants to leave a real legacy, it should build an AI ecosystem grounded in Australian values, fairness, inclusion, transparency, and trust. This isn't about banning ChatGPT, it's about asking who benefits, who's accountable, and who's at risk. The tech is here. The question is whether our democracy is ready for it. What Labor should do: introduce AI-specific legislation, pass a new AI Safety and Accountabilities Act targeting high-risk applications, mandate pre- and post-development testing, transparency reporting, and risk mitigation for general-purpose AI models, require companies to register high-risk use of AI and be accountable for harms, build sovereign capability. Fund the creation of Australian-trained foundation models that include First Nations languages, local accents, and public data. Invest in AI-specific infrastructure, including climate-friendly data centers. Support AI R&D in public institutions like the ARC and CSIRO. Reform AI use in workplaces. Expand workplace health and safety laws to cover algorithmic surveillance, automation, and job displacement. Guarantee consultation rights for workers when AI is introduced into workplaces. Mandate disclosure of automated decision-making in recruitment, rostering, and performance reviews. Defend creativity and cultural IP. Require AI developers to disclose training data. Ensure compensation for creators whose work is scraped or mimicked. Empower Indigenous communities to set terms for the use of their knowledge and data in AI systems. Establish a national AI commission. Create a permanent AI governance body to advise Parliament, coordinate agencies and enforce laws, ensure the Commission includes representation from civil society, academia, industry, and First Nations groups. Task the Commission with publishing risk registers, auditing models, and recommending bans where needed. Use AI to deliver better public services. Mandate government agencies to publish responsible AI blueprints for citizen-facing applications. Fund public sector pilots in areas like Medicare, Social Security, climate adaptation, and remote education. Launch a digital inclusion strategy to ensure access to AI-enhanced services for all Australians. And lead globally on AI ethics and governance. Advocate for a UN or G20 AI treaty focused on safety, climate impact, and equitable data access. Align Australian law with the EU AI Act and OECD AI principles while ensuring local control. Share Australian-led tools like AI explainability toolkits with Pacific neighbours. AI won't wait. Either we shape the future or Silicon Valley does it for us. Labor has a moment to lead with integrity, vision, and courage. Let's not let another digital decade pass us by. The next reform is truth in political advertisement. Australia has laws to protect consumers from misleading serial ads, but when it comes to an election ad, politicians can and do lie with impunity. The 2023 referendum on the voice to Parliament, again, gonna bang on that door. Facebook pages falsely claimed the Uluru Statement was 26 pages long. Mass texts and leaflets spread coordinated falsehoods, and there were no consequences. With the next federal election been and gone, it's time to fix that. The South Australian Truth in Political Advertisement law, in place since 1985, have not trilled free speech, been supported by both major parties, reduced the most egregious lies, been enforced without undermining electoral commission impartially. Interviewees across the political spectrum confirm that the TIPA laws improve campaign tone and force ads to be legally vetted and fact-checked before release. Campaigns in SA are run in a way that should not be possible federally, where lies go unchecked. South Australians support the laws. 84% of Australians do too. Trust in politics shouldn't be controversial. We regulate misleading ads about toothpaste. Why not about tax policy or asylum seekers? The fear that regulating lies is a slippery slope misunderstands what these laws actually do. They only apply to statements of fact, not opinions or promises. They are materially misleading during an election period and allow defences for reasonable mistake or lack of knowledge. In South Australia, TIPA laws didn't reduce robust debate, they reduced bullshit. What other countries do? Ireland gives its electoral commission powers to demand takedowns of disinformation, label false content, and block access. New Zealand, Canada, and the United Kingdom criminalise knowingly false statements about candidates' character. The EU mandates transparency and identity disclosure in political ads. The US, bound by the First Amendment, has no such laws and it's paying the price. What Labor should do: pass a federal Truth in Political Advertising Act by 2025 based on the SA model, cover false statements of fact that are materially misleading, apply to ads intended to influence an election, provide defences for those who took reasonable steps to verify claims, create a fast, independent complaints process led by either the Australian Electoral Commission or a new Truth in Advertising Tribunal, empower to issue modernise enforcement, ban deepfakes and deceptive AI in political ads, mandate platform takedowns for verified falsehoods, expand disinformation registers at Electoral Commission, tie compliance to public money. Breaching TIPA laws should trigger loss of public election funding, no taxpayer dollars for deliberate liars. Include a national source transparency standard. All political ads must clearly display who paid, their authorization, and whether AI was used. Lying works, that's why parties do it. But it erodes trust, disenfranchises voters, and poisons democracy. So I think with that, it ties into a lot of what we've already discussed, whether it be around, short-term window. So politicians try to be as sort of populist as possible to be elected. It goes back to mis and disinformation. It goes around AI. I think that all of these, and we're about to go into it. And look, I know that I mentioned the raise of the age of criminal liability, but I'm actually going to do a separate podcast, I think, around some criminal reforms that we can do. So we're going to park that one. But I think for me, and we're going to all talk about it, we could pick maybe one or two of these reforms and that would be totally fine. But I think that as a package, they're actually there's a lot of synergies here. We're tackling a lot of different things that actually feed into each other. And I thought, there's a lot of numbers thrown around here, and I took a step back and I said, well, what does that balance out to? What does the ledger look like if we did all of these? And so I ran some numbers. When we live in a country where the market price of lithium is higher than the political will to tax it, where billionaires and millionaires can negative gear their fifth property, but a kid in the Northern Territories can get arrested for stealing a Powerade, that's not a strategy. It's not how we should govern our country. And so I think that we could raise revenues from the right places and cut waste disguised as policy tradition. We end up with a balance sheet that doesn't just stack up and survive. It actually leads and we can start looking at our deficit numbers and how much interest we're paying on government debt and how do we tackle that. But I think my headline net result is plus 661.27 billion over 10 years. Just let that sink in. That is 2/3 of $1 trillion over 10 years. So let's break it down. The revenue, natural resource royalty reform, we think it's 660 billion in 10 years. Capital gains tax and negative gearing reform, plus 32.5 billion over 10 years. Alcohol tax reform, plus 28 billion over 10 years. Sugar tax, plus 4.98 billion over 10 years. Raise age of criminal responsibility. Let's leave that to one side for now because we'll talk about that in a different podcast. The spending that pays back itself. Universal childcare, minus 47 billion. AI governance and investment, minus 15 billion. We could supercharge that if we wanted. Combating misinformation, minus 160 million. Gambling ad ban, minus 300 million. Murdoch Royal Commission, minus 750 million. Truth in Political Advertisement, minus 250 million. Referendums, Republic for 4-year terms, combined around $3.25 billion. Even after all these initiatives, we're up more than 660 billion over the next decade. Most of it isn't from taxing people more, it's from charging rent on the stuff they already take from us for free. You want economic responsibility? Stop coddling landlords, letting miners squat on our national wealth, and pretending Facebook will regulate itself. Start taxing like we mean it. Start spending like we've got a future to build. Australia doesn't need more vision statements, it needs a spine. To wrap this up, because it has been a long podcast, I think that there are many grounds that Labor could attempt to sow either existing seeds or sow new seeds in order to bring us into a modern Australia where we reflect not only our society and community, but we reflect technological advances, fiscal responsibility. We advocate and we take ownership of our resources and we don't let it walk out the door for cents on the dollar. So these are some things I would love to see the Labor Party try and implement over the next 3, 6, 9 years, or maybe 4, 8, 12 years. We don't know, depending on that referendum on the 4-year terms. And I think for me, my biggest thing is I want to start talking to as many people about this. I think from a Labor point of view, being a part of the party, I want to start becoming more of a voice internally at my local branch, at a state level, even at a federal level. So I'm really excited about that. As for the podcast, I've actually really enjoyed this, but I think sitting in a room by myself and just me talking for an hour, although most people who know me would think that that's something I would love to do. I don't love it as much as talking to other people, and so this podcast will continue. But exciting news, and I've started talking to a few people about coming on, but I want to start a podcast called Yarns, and it will be with First Nations people, non-First Nations people. It will be with all types of people, just having a chat. I'm really interested in different people's stories. I'm very interested in hearing people's journeys in life, their careers, what gets them out of bed, what motivates them. Yeah, I'm just awfully excited to continue growing my network of friends and just get to know people. Like, I think that genuinely that is something that almost everybody universally can respect and understand, is you finding a community, you finding a group of people that you like spending time with and communicating with is such a rewarding feeling. And so, yeah, keep an eye out for that. But for now, this has been Capital and Country. Harry Stewart signing off.